Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deirdre Malone. I'm with the Irish Business Network Argentina, and you're very welcome to our three-part series, our conversation series on conflict. Today is the last conversation, and we're very pleased to have with us here today Justin Harman, former ambassador to Argentina, many other countries for Ireland, and Justin is going to be talking about Ireland's seat on the UN Security Council. So just to begin with, we're going to be looking at a short video, which Alicia is going to kindly show for us. And just in case there are other people joining in the next couple of minutes. So just bear with me while we change the screens. Thank you, Ali. Just bear with me again. So just for anyone who joined while we were showing the video, good afternoon and welcome. This is the third of the Irish Business Network's three-part conversation series on conflict. And we are here with Justin Harman, former ambassador to Argentina for Ireland, and who also worked towards Ireland's long 15-year journey to secure this seat on the Security Council in 2021. So Justin, welcome. If you'd like to tell us a little bit about your involvement and the journey Ireland has taken for its fourth temporary seat on the Security Council.
Thanks, Deirdre, and congratulations to everyone at the IBNA. It's a great series, great slides. Thanks for that. I hope everyone is safe and well, and great to see so many friendly faces around the table. I know I'm delighted to talk on our election to the Council. It's a major achievement for us, not least in the shadows of the pandemic. It's the fourth time that we will have served on the Council. We joined the UN in 1955, 10 years after its creation and the adoption of the UN Charter. The Charter created the Council as the supreme body with quite a unique legal authority to address threats to international peace and security. So in a way, I think you can look at it as collective security in its most global form. It is basically the rule of law in international affairs. It's made up of 15 countries. The permanent members, US, UK, Russia, China, and France, representing essentially the victors of the Second World War. And then there are 10 non-permanent seats, 5 for Africa and Asia, 2 for Latin America, 1 for Eastern Europe, and 2 for a group called WEOL, the Western European and Other Group, basically Western European countries together with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Elections are by all member states. That means every state has an equal vote, big or small, and a successful candidate must get at least 2/3 of the votes cast. On many occasions, these regional groups agree the candidates, and therefore there isn't a contested election. However, in our group, contested elections are the norm, and it's basically a formidable challenge to win. Since we joined in 1955, we have built a reputation as a country that punches above its weight at the UN, consistent, progressive policy positions. We'll talk about those, reflecting the priority we give to the UN. We've sought election successfully at 20-year intervals. So basically we see membership as a unique means of pursuing our values at a global level and indeed our interests. So we declared our candidature in 2005, 15 years ago, basically to showcase our foreign policy credentials, our international standing at the UN, to highlight our role through 6 decades in development, peacekeeping, disarmament, human rights. After the UK referendum in 2016, I think we also wanted to show that Ireland's foreign policy is not solely defined by Brexit. And we wanted also to build new relationships and partners. We competed with Canada and Norway for the 2 available seats in our group, sometimes known, by the way, as the Group of Death. Both are important internationalist countries with very strong records. So it was a friendly but intensely hard-fought competitive election. Some suggested that our 2 competitors had comparative advantages. Norway, for example, is very generous in development assistance. Canada is a member of the G7, of the G20. The Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, ran a very highly personalized campaign. And both countries are influential members of NATO. Many more diplomatic missions, bigger budgets, bigger teams. But the reality is, on the day we won, I was responsible as special envoy for the Latin American grouping, which involved maintaining close contact with decision makers, visiting capitals, holding bilateral meetings with ministers at regional conferences, etc. It was a secret vote on the 17th of June. I'm very happy to say that we secured overwhelming support in this region. In the election, we secured 128 votes out of the 193 member states in the first round. The quota was 128, which meant that we were elected in the first round. Norway secured 130 votes, 2 more than Ireland, and was also elected. Canada secured 109 votes. So why did we succeed? That's a question that I'm sure people might be interested in thinking about. It was, I think, one thing, and it may sound surprising in rather cynical times, but I do think that it was, in a sense, a confirmation that principles and values actually do matter. Still, even in a UN where elections are highly transactional, I think the majority of countries chose us for consistency, for authenticity, someone you can rely on. We've always said at the UN, what you see is what you get. That means we don't wax or wane. So I think it's a good positive perception of Ireland's role in the world today. Members of the council are elected with regard to their contribution to maintaining peace and security. I don't think anyone would suggest we haven't met this criterion, but in a campaign, a competitive campaign, you have to prove your claim. You have to demonstrate the case for every vote, every single vote. Never take a yes for granted and never take no for an answer. So it was a 15-year slog, many actors, a complex building up of support over time. We had strong political and public support at home in Ireland. at the same time, we also had significant issues to deal with, such as, for example, Brexit. There was a general election. We had a long period of negotiation for a new government. And of course, more recently, we had COVID bubbling away. So it was a challenge. Obviously, our membership of the EU was important, particularly in the post-Brexit, and we got a lot of significant support from the European Union. At a political level, we had a significant role played by President Higgins. He played a pivotal role because he had a direct engagement with leaders across Africa and Latin America. Mary Robinson, former president, was a true friend of the campaign. But we also had a lot of other people, including, for example, Eamon Gilmore, who visited this region. Other than political figures, we also had involvement by others. For example, Bono. We had groups like Riverdance. We had artists like Colin Davidson, Brian McGuire, poets such as the very late lamented Evan Boland, who played significant parts in a way communicating some of what you might call the intangible messages about Ireland. And I think in my own experience, these did resonate. In a sense, what it was a question of interweaving policy and culture. For example, Bono's reputation as a humanitarian really did help us to project our messages. So I suppose you can call it a Team Ireland effort, and it was successful. As to the sort of values we tried to project in the course of the campaign, I mean, we focused on three core issues: independence, you mentioned earlier, Deirdre, empathy and partnership. Just very briefly on independence, it's essential, of course. One has to remember that about 100 of the 193 member states of the UN have populations under 10 million. So they're what you might call small member states like Ireland, who rely on the multilateral system to provide stability. So we argued that in this very polarized, fragmented world, we could bring a unique independent voice. And that is a key differentiation, of course, from our competitors in one important sense, because we're not part of any military alliance. We're beholden to no one. And on issues like, for example, whether to address the climate crisis as a security issue, how to protect civilians in Syria, how to address possible annexation in the West Bank and the Middle East, having an independent voice is critical. And that was, I think, seen. I think countries also saw that Ireland had form in the sense of showing independence. In the early 1980s, while we were on the council, we faced the Malvinas crisis, and we were seen to take an independent stance. In 20 years later, in the aftermath of 9/11, we had the presidency of the council, and we were, I think, true to ourselves on that occasion as well. Recently, we took, for example, a strong position on a vote, an important vote in the UN relating to islands in the Indian Ocean, where the UK was a key player, and we very much supported the tiny island of Mauritius to respect its independence. The other value I would refer to is partnership. We have worked very closely with a whole series of partners on key issues. The Sustainable Development Goals, which you mentioned earlier, we've chaired the Commission on Women. We've been working very closely with the small island developing states. So that's in partnership. And the third value that I would mention is empathy. We have our own experience of conflict on the island. We have the peace process. And what we conveyed was that we did understand, perhaps like few others, just how difficult building peace and sustaining peace can be. So we wove, in a sense, that experience into our campaign, pointing out that we don't lecture or point fingers. We speak to all, we listen, we seek to understand, we encourage, we support. Empathy, in a sense, pervading the way we do business. We also argued that Irish Aid, our development program, is one that delivers for the most vulnerable and the least developed. So having ourselves only relatively recently experienced the trauma of mass migration, poverty, and even famine, we demonstrated that, in a sense, I would say adversity has bred a humanity, and that this, I know from my own experience, echoed in many of the conversations we had. Perhaps the most effective demonstration of that empathy was peacekeeping. Over 60 years of an unrivaled, unbroken record of peacekeeping. Compared to many developed countries who speak a lot about peacekeeping, very few send as many of their sons and daughters into the field as Ireland does. In fact, on a per capita basis, we're about the biggest contributor from the Western group. Many, I know, were astounded to hear that at any one time, around 13% of our defense forces are serving with the UN. So basically, that was the case we made. We were successful. It was an I should say, an unprecedented year. The application of the UN Charter in very strange times. It is true that not all is negative. I mean, there have been important points of progress, for example, in Afghanistan, Libya, to Colombia. But I think the underlying reality is that COVID is exacerbating conflicts in very fragile and vulnerable situations. And the big issue as we look at the Council over the next 2 years is how can it act to prevent the effects of COVID in fragile countries from leading to new or deepening conflicts? How can we strengthen the partnership to prevent future crises for erupting? An aspect of this that is important to bear in mind is the difficulty for the Security Council to function effectively. An example of this was that it took the Council almost 4 months to pass a resolution in response to COVID. That, a global pandemic, and yet the supreme body failed to actually adopt a resolution over 4 months. And this was, of course, largely due to the sharp differences between the US and China. And that points to the very challenging internal dynamic that we now face on the Council. Other tensions exist as well amongst the 5 permanent members. For example, the tensions that exist between the UK and Russia, US opposition to the EU position in relation to the Iranian nuclear program. There are tensions between India and China in the Himalayas, US, Russia, Chinese tensions with others on Syria and Libya, etc. So I would say that as we look forward, there are complex and protracted crises on the Security Council agenda. The ones I would point to particularly are Syria, Yemen, Libya, the Sahel and Africa, where these conflicts have become deeply entangled in geopolitics. The effect is to put millions at risk, causing instability far beyond their regions. The permanent members, by definition, have a big responsibility, but they're not alone in that. So we now have to think of how we're going to address this as we look forward to our 2-year period on the Council.
Justin, you talked about COVID, and I'm just going to go back to the previous slide, because when we spoke earlier, you talked about even the voting process and how logistically it was quite a challenge to have everybody come together to the UN building in New York.
That's right, of course, because the UN building was closed in Midtown Manhattan. So ensuring that it was possible to vote physically, it wasn't possible to vote virtually. So it meant that the ambassador of each of the member states had to personally attend the building staggered, obviously, socially distant. It was very challenging, and particularly because there were some who argued that the vote should be delayed. We argued for keeping the vote to the due date in June. So it was uniquely challenging, but also challenging to get your message across. Normally, the last weeks before the vote are spent rather in person-to-person contact in New York and elsewhere. None of that was possible. It all had to be done virtually, and that imposed entirely new challenges for us and indeed for the other competing countries. So as it happens on the day, we managed to secure the 128 votes, which took us over the line.
And as it's a 2-year period, so I was actually looking at it earlier today. So the 5 of the 10 countries who are temporary, 5 overlap another 5. So you would be with 10 other countries during that 2-year period. Is that right?
Well, the Council acts collectively, the 15 countries. 10 are elected for rotating periods. The other 5 remain on the Council permanently. But the Council acts collectively, and so it's the 15 member states. The one significant difference between the members who are permanent members and those who are rotating is that permanent members can wield a veto. That is, they can prevent a resolution being adopted or an issue being considered. And that, of course, is a significant issue for the functioning of the Council. But looking towards the future, the question is what awaits us. I mean, it's an enormous workload. There are about 30 live ongoing crises: Syria, Libya, Mali, the peace process in Colombia, Afghanistan. And then on top of that, you have these cross-cutting issues that affect global peace and security. For example, children in armed conflict, terrorism, women, peace and security. Underlying the next 2 years is the issue of how will a Biden administration approach multilateralism. That will have a very significant bearing on the internal dynamics of the Council. What will multilateralism look like under a Biden administration? Obviously, the underlying tensions with China will remain, but it may allow for significant progress nonetheless on specific issues. But frankly, we don't really know. We know the outlines of policy, but it isn't yet clear how that's going to translate into individual issues on the Council. But it's, of course, a very important development for the future of the 2-year period. Our approach, like looking at what we can realistically expect to achieve, I mean, the basic job is essentially building peace. That's the basic job. And we'll obviously be very active in shaping, for example, mandates for peacekeeping missions, and deciding how peacekeeping missions can adapt, because conflict, the nature of conflict is changing. We'll also be particularly focused on Africa. Something like 60% of the business of the Security Council is focused on Africa. And we have a lot of national experience in Africa, which we hope to bring to bear on this. One of the issues that we're anxious to promote is inclusiveness. That is, making sure that building peace isn't just a matter for governments or parties to conflicts. It should include civil society, young people. It should involve women from the outset. This is an important point for us. We know that, for example, when women are included in peace processes, the peace they help create lasts longer. That's been our own experience, and we want to see that. The second issue is how you can strengthen prevention. When you think of it, something like less than 200 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. I mean, these are people essentially who are victims of conflict. the Security Council has a duty to do a lot more. So we need a more proactive, preventative diplomacy, mediation. We want to see more mediation, quickly stepping in, not spending months trying to agree on mediators. We also, for example, and this harks back to something that we touched on in our meeting last week on non-proliferation and disarmament. We really do believe that nuclear disarmament and working to stop the proliferation of small arms, for example, in the Sahel region in Africa, are critical. We want to see peace building developed in all of the key conflict areas: Liberia, Sierra Leone, Colombia, Israel, the occupied Palestinian territory, Mozambique. But we also look to issues, for example, what are the drivers of global conflict? Foods, the big two that stand out, I think, for us are, first of all, food insecurity, and second, climate. I mean, man-made climate change is driving insecurity and instability. We heard this over and over in the campaign from all sorts of countries, particularly, for example, from small island states, developing states during the campaign. Hunger is another major issue driven by conflict, fueling conflict. 2/3 of the world's 74 million people suffering from acute hunger live in countries that are affected by conflict and insecurity. And then the final point I would just make is accountability. This is very important because I'm sure as you follow what's happening at the UN, you'll see that the respect for humanitarian law is being eroded. You can see indiscriminate attacks on civilians, on hospitals, on health workers. I think we see it as essential that when international humanitarian law is violated, that the Security Council must be seen to step in. So those are the sort of core values we'll try to bring to bear on the issues that will occur, will come to the agenda of the Council over the next 2 years.
Okay, great. You mentioned the Sahel region in Africa, Justin, and I actually was not aware of this region before you mentioned it last week. So it's sub-Saharan, stretches from west to east across the African continent, right?
Exactly. Just beneath the Sahara, much of Francophone Africa, Francophone countries who are hugely affected by the issues of climate change, and many of which are currently the subject of UN operations, some of which will be discussed in the course of our period on the Council. The future of the mandates, the future of peacekeeping. This requires a country like Ireland to bring a very detailed knowledge of how these conflicts have developed, what can be done. So we have to have ourselves our own independent source of information, contact, in order to be able to bring the values I discussed to bear on the discussions in New York. But the Sahel region is one that's particularly the focus of our concern.
And just before we open up for questions in general, Justin, you also mentioned when we first spoke that the Americas, Latin America, Central and South America is not really an area of UN, of the Security Council spoke.
No, happily, the Latin America does not figure largely on the agenda of the Security Council. Obviously, the situation in Venezuela is a source of continuing concern, particularly the humanitarian situation. And there is likely to be a need to follow closely, and it may actually be taken up in one form or another in the Security Council while we're a member. Secondly, there is a UN role in Haiti, which is going to affect, will be the subject of discussion, and we will be following that very closely. And thirdly, of course, there is a UN role in the peace process in Colombia. And we have a particular national role and national interest in relation to that process. So we'll be playing a very active part in those three areas.
Okay, great. I'm going to stop the slide sharing so people can see you. Maybe I should have done that before, Justin, but we're going to open up for questions now, and I'm just going to stop sharing. So, and open up the Zoom room to questions. Does anybody would anybody like to start? Open the question. You have to remember you have to unmute your microphones in order to ask a question. Orla?
Yeah, if nobody else has a question, I do. Hi everyone, my name is Orla Tracy. I'm one of the IBNA members as well. Justin, thank you so much for sharing all of that information. There's a lot of things I learned and didn't know before, so really appreciate it. As an Irish citizen, I think this seat makes me very proud, and it feels like something we should be very proud of. And I was just wondering if there's a cost to it. Is there any challenge from Ireland's point of view for being on this, or is there a political downside or something that you would see apart from it all being wonderful and us having a voice on this council? Is there another side to it that we don't know about?
Thanks, Orla. Yeah, very good question. And indeed, you're absolutely right. The first thing one has to say is there will be unexpected crises. There's no knowing what our Malvinas or our 9/11 moment will be over the next 2 years. The known unknown is that we will have one, or maybe more than one. And of course, that can pose particular difficulties for a small state where there are significant differences between the large permanent members. That was the case in relation to the Malvinas, in relation to our presidency of the Council in 9/11. And that can pose very significant difficulties with bilateral pressure being exerted by states in order to ensure that we take a particular position. So being independent is a value we attach considerable importance to, but it's not without cost, particularly in areas where there are significant tensions between the permanent member states. I'll give you an example. We were not on the council at the time of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Other countries, small countries, were on the council and came under extraordinary political pressure to adopt particular positions, which they had grave difficulty in dealing with. So I think that it is true. We could face, depending on the crisis that emerges, we could face very significant effort by permanent member states and perhaps others to take particular positions, whereas our policy position of independence might take us in another direction. So that is probably the single greatest challenge and potential difficulty that's there, I would say.
I guess, sorry, and then are those decisions then made by the Irish government if there is a specific pressure, or is it the Defence Forces?
No, I mean, the positions are dictated by the government. So okay. The Minister for Foreign Affairs is a member of the government, but would be the person with whom the decision falls, on whom the decisions falls, but obviously representing the government.
Okay, thank you. That was very interesting.
Thanks.
Hi there. I've got a question there for Justin. Firstly, congratulations, Justin. Great work on helping Ireland get nominated to the UN Security Council. I just have a question in regards to the veto system. It must be very frustrating that the smaller nations do a lot of work, background work, and you know, a lot of big decisions. An example being, for instance, regards to Palestine, America never votes against Israel. As a diplomat, how of a smaller nation, how do you deal with that frustration?
No, it's a good question, and good to hear you, Kieran. I agree. I mean, it is a source of significant frustration. It is a reflection, though, of the reality as it was at the time the Charter was adopted in 1945. The way in which the larger member states agreed to the creation of this instrument of collective security was granting them a veto power. But of course, the world has since moved on, and there is now a significant constituency in favor of UN reform. For example, how can we justify that France and Britain have permanent seats on the Security Council, whereas a country like India does not? So I didn't get into the subject, but there is a very important pressure by non-member states to reform the Security Council, to expand it, but there's no agreement. One of the most important aspects is this issue of the veto. I think that we just take the view that is the way it is. We are in favor of reform of the UN, and we're members of a particular group of countries working for a model of reform, but it is not a realistic short-term prospect. So we're focused on what we can do for the here and now, and we're working in a way using the moral. Even we don't have a veto; they're not the rotating members, but we do have a moral persuasiveness that can be very telling, and that has been shown by non-permanent members over the years, and significant advances have been made, even in contentious areas, simply by virtue of the influence, the moral influence and persuasiveness of the non-permanent members. But the whole issue of the reform of the Security Council is outstanding. It clearly is a picture of the world as it existed after the Second World War. It is no longer the reality of today. It is not the reality of today, and there needs to be reform. But of course, to secure reform, you have to work to achieve an agreement. And for the moment, that has escaped the UN system.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Kieran. Great question. Anybody else? Just remembering, if you have your microphone muted and you're trying to ask a question, I won't hear you. Well, if there are no more questions, we are coming to our 45 minutes. And so I would like to thank you, Justin. It's been a fantastic conversation, and we very much appreciate the time you've given us today. And I'm just going to share the screen again. Sorry. Put my glasses on. Just to extend that thanks to the three speakers we have had, and I've noticed some of you have been in our audience for all three conversations, so that's very much appreciated. And thank you for joining us, and we hope to be back in 2021 with more conversation series. So
thank you
if
very
there are
much,
no-
Deirdre. A great series, as I said.
And
Congratulations to
thank you
everybody
for
involved.
thank you for moderating them, Deirdre. It's been really, really well done and very professional. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
So yeah, keep an eye on our website for new events and we'll be in touch.
Okay.
And
Look
also
forward.
you can, sorry, I interrupted you, Justin, just to say that Alicia has already uploaded the first 2 conversations to our website and YouTube. And I'm assuming Ali will be able to see this one also, or those who haven't had a chance to watch it live will be able to see it soon as well. So I'm wishing that everybody has a safe Christmas and a safe end to the year. And as I said, I'm sorry I interrupted you, Justin. Did you have something else to say?
No, other than that, it's a very interesting chat to have had today as we face this unknown period. We don't know what the world is in a very strange place, obviously, with COVID. Perhaps we should reconvene 2 years down the road in order to discuss how we lived up to the commitments that we have made. I look forward to that.
That would be great. So
All
thank
the
you,
best to
everyone.
everybody.
Have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Thank you.